Warning, this review does contain some mild to moderate spoilers. I've tried to avoid major spoilers, which means that the main quest lines for both the core game and the White March expansion aren't revealed. I've also avoided discussing the ending slides for the companions, but I do delve into soul-related lore, and that is a big part of the world's setting. I discuss how it ties into the story in many ways. I also reveal how the intro goes and how that ends. Some of the side quests are also explained thoroughly too, as examples for various things. So if you're looking for a review that avoids all spoilers, then this isn't the review for you. But if you only want a review that avoids the most major plot spoilers, then this should work well enough. Pillars of Eternity is an isometric RPG that came out in 2015. Later on, in the same year, the White March expansion Part 1 was added on. The year after, Part 2 came out. It can be bought all bundled together now. I got the definitive edition for free in one of Epic Games' giveaways. I played Pillars of Eternity a long time ago, but not the White March expansion, and I only vaguely remembered the game. So I decided to give it a replay, both to try the new content and to review it. So that way I'd remember what it was like in the future and not wonder all over again. The story. During character creation, a player can choose from several races, classes, and backgrounds. This is supposed to generate unique dialogue as the game's played through. However, unfortunately, what's picked doesn't truly matter as far as role-playing or immersion goes. The player will have the occasional detail noticed, but this feature wasn't well integrated into the story in my experience. For example, godlike are supposed to be rare and viewed warily. The game tells you that the godlike are often viewed with fear and wonder, but that not all of the subtypes are created equal. The most fortunate are the moon godlike, but even they are only the most tolerated and not well accepted. On the other side of the scale, the death godlike face extreme prejudice. They are hated outcasts, and it's considered normal for babies of this subtype to be slaughtered. They're viewed as having a sinister appearance, are the most distrusted of their kind, and the reason why they're commonly killed at birth is due to a superstition which frames them as harbingers of doom for resembling the goddess of death, Barath. I decided to play as the death godlike because those lines suggested to me that picking it would lead to many good roleplay experiences. Yet, instead of causing reactions everywhere, it rarely mattered, even in situations where it really should have. For example, the god that these godlike resemble is called Barath, and she has 2 separate temples in the game. Yet, even Barath's own clergy don't react to the PC being a godlike.
Out with you! I already told you what... I'm sorry. How may I help you?
Let alone as a person who's a rare, walking, embodied symbol of their god. You'd think that being a sacred symbol in a sacred temple would generate some kind of different response. Yet, instead of being affected by this situation in any way, every NPC had generic responses. I could even ask to be told about Barath while my PC stood there with her holy markings, and get treated like anybody else who was unaware of her. Similarly, there's only one other death godlike in the game, and when he was encountered, then he didn't even acknowledge my PC as being of the same, rare, stigmatized race. In the entire game, including in the White March expansion, being a death godlike only mattered 4 times, and it was positive in 2 instances and neutral in 2. In the core game, a follower of Barath noticed that my PC was a death godlike, and there were a few lines of flavor text about it. A little boy also commented on her facial markings. In the White March expansion, there was a single interaction that was small but well done, and my PC could ask for some minor favors. In the other interaction, someone just randomly commented on her facial markings, again.
Watch it! Distract me again and you're like to lose an eye. Or whatever it is you've got.
Sadly though, even these 4 beats felt odd in context. This was because, since my PC's race was generally ignored, it felt as if being noticed as a walking echo of death itself should be dismissed. Having it be normal was obviously wrong for the setting, since it went against the game's own lore, but it felt that the devs just forgot about their own lore, and so I could forget too, because while that was disappointing, at least the lack of any acknowledgement let me mostly forget about my disappointment. Having it randomly, rarely acknowledged only underlined that missing content, which gave me a feeling of, okay, why is this happening now? The first time it was noticed was especially odd in context too, because it occurred shortly after walking through one of Barath's temples and having her obvious symbolism 100% ignored by her own devout clergy. As for distrust, which was underlined as the most common thing for the death godlike to experience, it didn't happen to me once in the game. This made the positive and neutral NPC reactions feel even more awkward in context. Instead of mattering for roleplay in this RPG, the most common thing that happened was that NPCs would do a line about the PC looking distinct or something like that. The conversation goes on. It comes across as if the PC only had a weird hairstyle. This was also problematic because not all godlike are supposed to be viewed as equal. While humans from various places are still seen as human, dwarves are dwarves, Orlans are Orlans, and so on, the godlike, according to the game's own lore, are distinct. A moonlike's supposed to be treated much differently than a deathlike. Yet, in-game, the way NPCs reacted made it feel as if being a death godlike was just the same as being any other godlike, in a world where many were religious.
Why, she's the goddess of song, art, the sky, and maternity. She's gentle and brilliant, speaking to her followers in dreams, inspiration, and birdsong. It is said that she wears a cloak adorned with a feather from every bird known to kith or wilder, and that she manifests in the flocks themselves.
Aye, and in the screams of childbearing, which I can assure you is not so beauteous a thing.
This is true, which is why midwives are widely considered clergy of Helia, as are many artists and poets. In any case, those of us who follow her feel closest to her splendor in a place where we might share light, song, and a view of the blessed sky.
Different gods' markings meant different things to different people, and the markings were considered a big deal in general. That dismissive tone didn't seem to fit with the lore, especially since the godlike were supposed to be tolerated, at best, by those who weren't followers of the god in question. Even the intro got off to an awkward start with this, because in the intro, my character being a godlike was ignored, but the choice for background wasn't. One of the initial temporary companions spoke about the background I'd chosen in character creation and thought that my PC seemed dangerous only because I'd chosen Raider. Otherwise, she thought my PC seemed absolutely fine and normal. Plus, choosing godlike comes with a unique cost. The godlike aren't supposed to be able to wear headgear. The slot is locked out for the player because of this. But there are 2 scripted events which ignore this fact. One of these scripted events is also very important because it can lead to a game over if the player doesn't wear a certain helmet or pass a high constitution check. If the player fails or lacks the helmet, then they drown. So there's not much immersion based on the player's background, at least in my experience.
You must be one of the new settlers. Welcome to Gilded Vale. You'll be pleased to know that we've had some recent vacancies here. Of course, we'll need to make some inquiries first. The inestimable Lord Radric VII has taken great pains to insulate our town from Widewind's legacy. Have you ever conceived a Hollowborn child? Have you ever conceived a Hollowborn child?
A few moments later.
There are many combinations to choose from, so it's possible that some combinations are better than others. But when the most stigmatized one possible gets little reaction, then I don't expect that any of the other races get more frequent immersive reactions. Anyway, Regardless of what background or race you choose, your PC is both awakened and a watcher, and these traits are what's important and equal across all playthroughs. A watcher has the ability to read souls, speak to the dead, influence souls, direct souls, and even can absorb them. An awakened person is someone who remembers snippets of their own past lives, sort of. I'll get to that later because how reincarnation and past lives are handled in this game is a big, messy topic on its own. The game starts off with a traveling caravan. The PC gets sick, goes looking for some medicinal berries, and the caravan is attacked in the meantime. You can save up to 3 companions, but only temporarily. Nobody matters here but you. How you'll inevitably lose these companions feels forced, since they'll die in a scripted event, and their loss feels cheap. The player can't even bury them, although their bodies can be looted. Later on, one sister will briefly inquire about her, and that's about it. The intro is a very small part of the game. However, I didn't like it because in role-playing games, I like teammates to be valued. The way that they were quickly discarded felt cheap. I didn't think it was a good first impression. The intro ends with the PC's motivation: hunt down that mysterious robed man. The reason why is urgent. Seeing him triggered the PC's old memories of kinda sorta past lives, when the two knew each other, and the PC will supposedly go insane if too much is naturally remembered without prompting. The way to remain sane is framed as this: find and question that formerly known figure, because then he should be able to do a Q&A about how they knew each other and what happened in their mutual past. That guided remembering is supposed to be the key, because it prevents the PC's memories from naturally flooding back on their own, and that keeps them sane since being prompted is a more gentle process. As the player chases after this mystery man, various problems, fetch quests, bounties, companions, and adventures are uncovered. Most of these are not mandatory for the main plot. You can even custom make companions by hiring NPCs at any inn. These NPCs won't have dialogue trees, quests, or any story interaction. This means that how much you want to do in the game is entirely up to you, and that not even the companions are necessary. However, what you choose to do does influence the epilogue. The pre-made companions have good or bad endings. Some NPCs can have good or bad endings. The towns that you travel to can have good or bad endings based on your influence, and you can also build up a base that does well or not, too. The game is rather long if you do everything there is to do, and story-wise, I found that the side events are a mixed bag. Some of the quests were interesting. For instance, dragons are dangerous, but they are also highly sentient. Do they deserve to survive or not? Your choice. I won't spoil the story details behind these dragons, but there are a few dragons to encounter, and each one has a different personality, dilemma, and set of ways to handle them. Other quests were typical fetch quests. Grab this, go here, and these of course were less interesting, but some quests had problems. They were either buggy, nonsense, or both. For instance, there's a lord who did something extremely terrible. You can kill him, and the game even notes that no one will be aware that you did. No one could hear you. Yet, if you do dispose of him after a brief chat, then your reputation in his home city will decline. Somehow, people there were aware, even though they shouldn't have been aware. Yet, if you just kill him outright, without speaking to him first, then the quest will still conclude, and no one will know you killed him, and even months later, his guards will still be walking around the town you killed him in. In another case, a little girl is lost.
Mila, where have you got to this time?
And it turns out that she was playing in a place 12 hours away in a snowy wasteland filled with dangerous predators in clothes more suited for summer, and then chilling with ravenous, insane creatures that she calls her friends. They also don't attack her because she fed them chicken. When you tell the child to go home, then you can't even escort her back home. She treks through the snow for another 12 hours all alone. In yet another example, the PC can pose as an important religious figure, and then use a grappling hook to swing into a forbidden area in front of several adherents who ought to find that behavior rather suspicious and who ought to go aggro. As if that wasn't awkward enough, remember, you must gather your party before venturing forth. A whole party has 6 people, and they're all using that grappling hook to venture forth, including my Ranger's bear. I'm not sure how that worked. I could give many more examples of lame or odd quests than those 3, too. I could also give more good examples beyond those 3 dragon side quests that I mentioned, too. As I said, the quests are a mixed bag. Unfortunately, it's difficult to tell whether or not a quest will pay off story-wise or reward-wise. In order to find out how good it is, you just have to do it. Plus, in addition to experience points, items, and monetary rewards, many quests also boost a player's reputation, which in turn adds to the chance of a better overall ending for the game's story. This means that while a player can pick and choose what quests to do or not do, and they're not mandatory, there are still several reasons to do many of them, and each one can either wind up being a cool experience or a letdown. This is frustrating, because when the game does well, it feels satisfying, but that satisfaction isn't consistent. As for the main story, and how the mystery man and your PC are tied, that is messy from a story perspective. The chase and search are interesting for a while, but the lore behind why it's happening isn't really set well. Hints are dropped as the player follows his trail, but if a player pays close attention, then much of these points clash with each other. Because of this, as reasons were revealed, I felt the same mixture of satisfaction and dissatisfaction. The basic idea behind why your PC knows him has to do with souls, but this is less straightforward than it ought to be, and that's due to clashing writing. In the game's lore, a soul undergoes reincarnation, and as it does, entropy takes effect. Souls are basically just a material, which is something called essence. A soul splinters over time, combines with other souls, splits into new souls, and so on. This means that a person's soul is basically like a soul version of Frankenstein's flesh monster, made up of various dead people to form a new person. Plus, bits of souls can break off and become both independent and unaware. This essence can be used in special ways, which also indicates the essence isn't a consciousness on its own. You can even buy it bottled. That idea is interesting, souls being formed out of a substance, ethereal atoms. The problem with it is that the game can't seem to stick to its own lore, because the writing consistently tries to hold people accountable for whatever their soul bits did in the past. To be clear, I don't just mean the NPCs do this, but that even the narration does this. Yet doing that would be like blaming Frankenstein's monster for horse theft, because the guy his arm came from stole a horse when he was alive, and you can ID the arm on the newly made monster due to a scar. For souls, a memory in essence would be much like a scar on flesh. It's all just transplanted material. And if you're dealing with a whole new person, then he or she can't be held responsible for whatever past marks their bits retained, because the lives that are being remembered aren't actually their own past lives. Instead of being true personal memories, they're just marks from past use, things carried over in the material itself. Memory is no longer a linear timeline of choices, because past lives are not their own past. These memories are simply an inheritance from somebody else. It's leftover data. Assigning moral judgment over these marks for past crimes that someone living never did and is often horrified by makes no sense. After all, we're not actually talking about amnesiacs here. Living souls can remember events done by other people, but only due to what's stamped onto their essence. They didn't actually make those decisions in the past. Instead, it's just like when the watcher reads souls in the game and feels and sees what they felt. The watcher isn't truly becoming a different person, even when the writing says they feel, they see, they are. But the watcher does walk in someone else's past shoes and relives the memories as if those were the watcher's own choices. This lack of personal decision is further underlined by additional concepts that the story introduces too. For instance, souls can split into multiple people, and independent consciousnesses can fight for expression and control inside of a single body. If there are multiple beings beings, multiple independent people being made, then you're not dealing with one amnesiac, but with unique people in their own right. After all, if two beings are fighting for control of a vehicle, and there's no way to merge both of their personalities into a natural whole, then these are separate people, much like an egg splitting in the womb and making twins. You wouldn't try to mash two twins into one person, even though they came from the same material. There's also the fact that souls can combine, with bits of one person becoming bits of another, which complicates things even further. If a thief and his victim can combine, then how could you blame him for stealing from himself? Plus, reincarnation is a reduce, reuse, recycle kind of process. Some beings feed on essence, it's used for magic, it gets sheared off over time via entropy, and entropy eventually ruins the wholeness of all beings. And it's always worked this way. This is why only strong souls, chunks of essence that weren't splintered too much in the recycling process, resemble who they were in past lives, because they're mostly the same person. To put it into physical terms, if their soul was a body, then maybe they only lost a pinky finger. They're not an entirely new hodgepodge of parts. However, it's surmised that all beings eventually succumb to entropy. It's far more common for living people to be very different from whatever personalities their material was attached to in the past. So, yeah, blaming people for past lives in all of this context seems like it's a stupid idea, yet it's commonly forced in the story's writing. Even at one point in the game, the PC has to deal with their so-called choices in past lives and answer some questions about why they did what they did. The player only gets to choose flavor text for these choices because what was done is in the past and therefore unchangeable for the plot. It's weird story-wise, and as a player who didn't make those choices, it felt awkward having NPCs in scripted events say that my PC did this or that. When I first played the game years ago, I'd made a very benevolent character, and so it had felt especially strange to hear these criticisms involving a past life. The lore's contradictions made it even worse, because the lore often contradicted this sense of you're at fault. I remember that I kept thinking how none of it fit the character that I'd made. Having to face a disparate, disconnected backstory on top of lore which couldn't seem to make up its mind, which didn't make sense in order to make it work, seemed especially strange. It was so odd that it was the main thing that I remembered when I played again recently, even though I'd forgotten most of the game otherwise. I remember that I kept thinking how none of it fit the character that I'd made. I didn't like how it forced my character to seem a certain way, and that the lore often had been sort of wishy-washy about whether or not souls were responsible for their past lives. And I could go even more into depth on souls and how the game screws up its own lore, but frankly, this would become a very long essay-style video, and I'm not going for that. I'm also well aware this is going to be a rather long review, so I'm going to just briefly cover a couple more essential topics and then move on. Those topics are character motivation and abilities. The motivation for chasing down the mystery man makes little sense. Why would gentle reminders from someone telling an awakened watcher about their past matter at all? It seemed to me like remembering was remembering, that it'd be overwhelming either way. As I played and more hours of this plot point passed by, the motivation seemed weaker and weaker. This was because, through flashbacks, it seemed as if my PC ought to have realized almost everything on her own. The Q&A seemed less and less important to achieve as she remembered more, but the game's writing tried to make finding him still sound direly important. The contrast between what was playing out in the game and the urgency that it tried to give me felt awkward. What was going on just didn't fit with a sense of urgency. Similarly, the Watcher's soul-based abilities are also handled poorly throughout the game. It's underlined twice that when the Watcher speaks to ghosts, then the Watcher isn't truly speaking their language, because that's not necessary for souls to communicate. And this makes sense, since after all, no physical bodies are making noise to speak with. The communication of a Watcher transcends all language barriers, until it randomly doesn't. At one point, certain ghosts are off limits until their language is acquired. Plus, the Watcher can control souls, and yet many lost souls have to be physically fought. Spirits are an enemy type in this game. This means that while the player can shred souls, bind souls, extinguish feelings, alter memories, guide souls, and more, that dealing with them is often handled through physical combat. On top of that, when a fight is over, then it's possible to pick up spirits' essences for crafting. This is lame, since essence has power. The Watcher can clearly gather it up, and it's even needed at an important story beat. Despite this, these battle rewards of essence are treated just the same as wood, gems, and other crafting material. Plus, lights and some other spirits are supposed to be formed from particularly strong essence, which means that what's being gathered should be especially potent. It should enable the Watcher to become incredibly powerful, because the Watcher can absorb essence. This is established firmly in the game, multiple times, yet the player can only use it for crafting. The game regularly tends to forget what the Watcher's powers are, and I could list more instances of that happening. For instance, here, this dialogue choice should be marked as lie. As I said, the lore is messy, and this is a big deal because the main story is entirely based around the concepts of souls, past lives, and a sense of culpability. The player gets no real say in what the PC did in their past lives, and towards the end, many of the so-called dialogue options about the past are either singular or minor bits of flavor text. Meanwhile, soul-based powers come and go as the plot needs them to, and the nature of souls also fluxes as needed for the plot. Little that's established matters. This lack of consistent writing is disappointing because the main plot isn't all bad. As with the side quests, it's a mixed bag. There are some choices that feel as if they have a large impact on the world and the people in it. Some major story threads also have their entwined mysteries revealed, such as why babies were being born without souls. And those reveals do make sense in the lore. The good revelations are also complex enough to give a player a sense of satisfaction, but unfortunately, being satisfied at points still doesn't change the fact that much of the story is shaky and doesn't follow its own guidelines for the setting. Much gets overlooked in the story, and this happens constantly. The player can find it all around the game. For instance, even the shops have a major, funny, in-world flaw. The Glenfathan are established as being hugely protective over the ancient and Gwithan ruins, and every artifact that comes from them. In one quest, a city-dwelling Glenfathan will attack your party in the middle of a tavern if you don't give him a necklace. On another quest, some Glenfathans will warn you to leave and try to kill your party if you refuse or just approach them again. There are many examples. These Glenfathans are rabid about their no-touchy rule, yet you can sell them in Gwithan daggers, shields, and other things that you find in the ruins. You can also buy them back for reasonable prices if you like. And speaking of the NPCs, I'm gonna mention this because it was a funny quirk to me. Some quest-based fights happen in public. Once you win, you can strip the enemy's bodies and have no one react to the deaths or the corpse looting. Townspeople will keep drinking and laughing in the tavern like nothing happened. Outdoors, city guards patrol the streets, but they'll keep patrolling by bodies without comment or pause. It's also worth noting that some additions in the game are Kickstarter related. These are tombstone memorials and special NPCs. They're just rewards for backers and little else. Even the game notes that the tombstone memorials can harm immersion if you read them, and that the NPCs with golden plates are backer rewards. Unfortunately, these tombstones are not limited to one or two areas of the game. They're in several locations. Some of their content is amusing, but much of it is not. They're also a little strange to see, because even if you don't click them, then there's still constant reminders of real life poking its headstone up again and again. By the way, small bit of trivia. There was a hullabaloo about one of these back in 2015. It was accused of being transphobic, and the game was edited to censor it since some people found it hateful. The devs did check with whoever paid for it, and the person agreed to change it, but it was still censored due to a negative reaction. And I think that negative reaction was dumb, especially if you notice how the last name's misspelled. It seems like you could interpret it in different ways, including that Firedorn was a stereotypical bard, someone who couldn't even spell his own name right, but still saw himself as a desirable ladies' man. After all, that's often the stereotype for a a bard. Someone who wants to be seen as a macho ladies' man, or a men's lady, or ladies' lady, or a man's man. Just basically a horny character that, more often than not, is probably gonna have something happen to them due to their hormones. The changes made by the author of it also seem to indicate that it was indeed misread as a hateful thing. As for the special NPCs, I found them to be annoying as well. I remember a long time ago when I first played, this line had me convinced that checking them all would give me a secret bonus.
Your power will grow stronger with each soul you touch, as it allowed you to reach out to mine.
It was a conclusion that I jumped to on little evidence, but at the time, I had figured that it made sense because it would be a clever mechanic for the devs to use. It would encourage players to interact with the NPCs. I thought that there might even be an Easter egg or two to find. After all, it'd be a neat way to add some extra value to what people paid for, and to better integrate their purchases into the game. So, back then, hunt away I did. I checked them for Easter eggs. Unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, there isn't anything to find other than a pet cat. On my recent second playthrough, I still dislike these NPCs because of their nameplates and, well, very existence. Much like the tombstones, they constantly reminded me of the Kickstarter backers while I wanted to try to get into an RPG. The lack of aforementioned role-playing was already annoying. This stuff felt like sprinkles on the sad cake. Plus, when I was playing tired and trying to rush through quests, then I sometimes didn't notice that they were special NPCs, but the Kickstarter ones, and clicked on them, which felt distracting and annoying. Some even are in houses which have nothing else of merit inside of them, which means more wasted time going in, waiting for the loading screen, going back out, and waiting for the loading screen again. Some houses, which aren't marked on the maps, are used for quests, and so checking them makes sense. Due to my frustration, I made up a bit of a minigame for myself of trying to kill them. Some have tags which cause reputation loss, but several actually don't. Trial and error. While doing this, by the way, I also noticed that some actual world-based NPCs lacked those tags too. Additionally, if you kill a shopkeeper, then the game will cheat you out of their stock. They won't drop it. By the way, speaking of being cheated, the game often cheats the player out of proper rewards. For instance, at one point, there was this mound of treasure. The writing says it's massive and filled with coins. You bury your arm to the shoulder, and you still haven't reached the bottom of the pile. There are a few different currencies in here, but it all adds up to a total of 3,817 copper pieces. To put this amount into perspective, fine quality armor sells for 240 CP, basic hide armor for 40 CP, and useless clothing sets go for 20 CP a pop. You get a lot of gear as you go. So while the copper is a little helpful, it's not great at all. It's not treasure trove quality. When I was able to retrieve it, then I already had 17,707 CP and thousands more sitting in unsold inventory since I didn't need to spend much at the time and hadn't seen the need to liquidate it yet. That makes the amount of treasure here a letdown, and the description of it feel inappropriate. As for the recruitable companions, many of their personalities were okay, but I didn't adore any of them. There were a few funny lines, but that was about it. There are 11 companions total. I thought that 5 of them were decently likable: Adair, Aloth, Kanarua, Sagani, and the Devil of Karok. Yet, due to limited conversations in their chat menus and the banter being both sparse and wonky, I didn't feel attached to them. The other 6 were mediocre. Pelagina was kind of aloof, and I thought that the accent that she was given sounded awkward.
Your own father sold you to the Brotherhood?
He hated me anyway. I was glad to be gone. The Dukes are my parents now. The Republics, my children.
That's an interesting way of looking at it.
The grieving mother never even got a name, let alone a good understanding of her as a person. Mena was moralizing and weirdly so at points such as,
"You all sure have a lot of traditions."
In Masuk, it's our connection to our past that keeps us going.
I'll say, it's kept you going for 5 years.
And yours has kept you running for 30.
I'm gonna look at this thing over here.
And one point, when she randomly interrupts the PC for a chat, she notes that she doesn't fully understand what's going on, but she still wants the PC to sympathize with someone who hurt them. It's an odd moment. It's also clearly due to her thinking of her own past issues, so it's just odd. After all, generally with a friend, you would at least want to understand why they were hurt or upset at someone before you would say, hey, I know you're upset at this person and I don't understand why, but I want you to think of their feelings. Not that I'm taking their side, but just, you should consider their feelings. Just saying. Okay, we can keep running now. Zahua was a constantly high masochist who enjoyed the pain of others. His hungry for pain interjections didn't seem to fit with a man who had both average intelligence and perception, because he often seemed to be a sort of wacky psycho. It was also hollow to hear him say zany lines about being high, such as having a hallucination, but never actually see him acquire stat effects from his drug use. Everything with him was just meant to be silly, except for his backstory. Given the world's setting and often grim finds,
shut it about the blazing dogs.
his comical intent didn't work for me. Instead, he seemed like an ill-placed comedic relief, which would better belong in an anime or an off-the-wall comedy with a bumbling stoner. Durance was an awkward troll. It seemed as if whoever wrote him wanted him to be the kind of person who tried to offend others to test their integrity when they're under pressure. But he didn't seem offensive to me. Instead, he just came off as dumb. An old man yelling words like whore and hoping to get a reaction. His provocations were childish.
Have you ever chased a skirt wizard? Or do you merely hide behind them?
Don't pawn your personal problems off on me.
They will use you, cast you off when it suits them, never speak another word to you.
Maybe they just don't answer to fiery whore.
This was made odder by his dark backstory. He was an unrepentant murderer of innocent people, which made him seem unstable. Add that onto his present attitudes about his past slaughter. He had a stated joy to continue it. As a result of that, he seemed like someone that the player and various party members ought to want to kill once they learned about his past, especially in the case of the grieving mother, who absolutely adored children.
This place, as beautiful as it can be with the absence of children.
Yet, instead of wanting to hurt him or being horrified by his past, almost none of the companions seem bothered by his willingness to slaughter the innocent. Instead, Adair just wants to tease him.
You mind if I borrow some of that Malkachoa?
You are searching for insight?
Nah, I was just gonna feed it to Durance while he was sleeping and pretend to be the ghost of Aethys.
I also have a pepper that will make him think he is being slowly devoured by a great serpent, if you are interested.
Aloth seems annoyed with him, and the grieving mother says nothing. I did read online that the Devil of Karak has a more passionate line regarding Durance's nature and how to handle him, but I never got that line in game. However, since Durance was also clearly tied to major world events, keeping him around seemed like a good metagame idea because it seemed certain to lead to more story options, and so I did keep him around. Unfortunately, I didn't get more story options, but keeping him around and doing his side quests did at least give me a little extra lore about some events and his faith. That said, I still didn't like him as a character. I think that he could have been written better. Hiravias was similar to Durance in being vulgar for vulgarity's sake. He seemed to love saying things for shock value.
My mother's crotch. You?
For the record, only I'm allowed to insult my mother. But I respect your dedication to banter, so I'll let it slide. This time. Her zeal is sincere, and I can tell you she's destined to die on her feet. And she's easy on the eyes. Can't fatten a thoroughbred, that's what I always say. I just wonder if she has a cloaca or not. Ooh, the curiosity's killing me. Yeah, cloaca. It's a combination feces chute and happy slot. Birds usually have these hybrid holes, and I figure she might too. What? Don't look at me like that. We can speak another time. Lead the way. Oh, him? Him I don't mind too much. Though I could pitch a tent with the pole wedged up his anus. Oh, I think I could fit 3 of me, plus a remainder of a 4th Hiravius inside that giant. Gods, am I glad he's friendly. And between you and me, he has a better singing voice than the prettiest lasses I know from my tribe. It's one part unsettling, two parts arousing. And it makes me wish I still had both ears. Yeah? Oh, what is it about Delumgon that gets my tree trunk blooming? My logic tells me that they don't have any good poke holes and probably kill you after copulation. Still.
But he lacked the very dark past. So, yeah, no attachments to characters there. They seemed either just okay or hollow to me. It is worth noting, though, that their voice actors were, on the whole, really good. However, there were issues which harmed how the voice lines were delivered, and those problems made the good acting in them less impacting. However, those issues are a sound issue, and so they're covered under the look and sound section later on, since this is the end of the story section. The gameplay. One restriction, which I encountered right away, was the inability of a godlike to wear headgear except in those two aforementioned scripted story beats. You can't even equip the same helmet that's allowed in those scripted events, because the slot is locked. Headgear can give many perks. In my opinion, picking godlike wasn't worth losing the gear slot, because it wasn't compensated with the implied roleplay experiences in the racial description. However, losing the gear slot wasn't an extreme problem. Gear is plentiful in this game, and it comes with all sorts of benefits. Stat boosts only apply to the highest value per stat, which makes balancing out stats easy to plan out, since it's impossible to hone in on one thing too much. Though, an important caveat here to gear boosts is that some weapons do give boosts too, and those do stack. Anyway, I'd just place the highest dex boost, then the highest resolve boost, maybe an accuracy bonus here, and so on. I played on hard mode and the game really wasn't that hard because I could customize my party well. However, it is worth noting that how many camping supplies you can carry on hard mode is restricted. I found that to be annoying just because it meant that I had to run back and get supplies more often than I would like to, or have my characters wander around maimed. As for good gear, there are soulbound items which are rather op. There's even one that literally just destroys vessels. It has a rather good chance to do so per hit. I used this to take down major foes. One particular fight took me a bit under 3 minutes, and that was just because I'd been expecting a hard battle and had been carefully, unnecessarily queuing commands. When I stopped pausing, it was over in about 6 seconds, because Adair took down one large enemy in his first hit, ran to another, swung once, and then took down the other large enemy on his third hit in this battle. The fight was over shortly afterward. The one enemy that remained was easily dispatched. This sword was also useful on other occasions. Combat isn't only easy due to soulbound items, though. Many unique magical items are also rather great. For example, here, Adair is using the Saber of the Seas. Its Overwhelming Wave enchantment has a 10% chance of activating per hit, and it will happen once per battle. Not only will the wave do 20 to 30 crush damage, but it will also stun all of the enemies in its path for 4 seconds. On a tank in the thick of things, this is pretty good. Targets are also susceptible to sneak attack if they are either blinded, flanked, hobbled, paralyzed, petrified, prone, stuck, stunned, or weakened. Apprentice's sneak attack gives characters a 15% ranged and melee bonus damage. Merciless Companion gives rangers pets a 30% bonus damage, and so on. Plus, while some abilities require a rest to recharge, per encounter abilities do not. This means that weapons with per encounter abilities, such as Saber of the Seas, are rather good, and so are per encounter character abilities, such as knockdowns from rangers' pets. While these are only a few examples out of many, I think you can see how the game is versatile in its item offerings, talents, and abilities with just those few examples. Because of this versatility, it's not difficult to defeat any of the enemies in the game. For instance, on one very hard enemy, I was being stubborn in my approach and it was taking a long time. I found that it suddenly became very easy once I noticed that the enemy was vulnerable to petrify, and focused on that as well as interrupting it instead of targeting its minions. This sudden ease meant that it actually wasn't a hard fight. I'd just been being a hard head on how to approach it. I found that aspect of the game to be nice and fun. I like it when tactics matter. Unfortunately, I didn't often encounter this in the game. Most enemies went down easily, and I didn't need to apply much in the way of tactics. The complex, difficult fights were very few and far between. The most that I usually needed to do was either to kite enemies or lure them towards choke points. Their pathfinding was also rather bad. so sometimes I killed them by kiting when I was trying to lure them to my party. Anyway, despite the combat's problems, I did find it to be one of the fun parts of the game due to its customizable nature. There was a lot to play with. This meant that while it was mostly smooth sailing, it was still complex enough to be fun to play around with when combined with the lore. Although the lore's interesting nature does wane over time, the combo of flexible combat options and the lore works well enough for a very long time. It's just that over time, the combat begins to feel tedious and the lore begins to unravel. There are also even more points of tweaking characters' combat styles that I haven't even covered yet. Retraining, pets, and quick slots. I'll go over those 3 quickly. You can retrain characters at any inn, which makes customizing even the pre-made companions to suit you a breeze. It also doesn't cost all that much. The PC can have a pet. There's a special slot for this. The pet is visible on the map and will follow you around, but it's mostly just aesthetics. Unfortunately, they lack lore. I had the Black Hound following me around because I'd hoped to find its owner and get a little extra story. So they're mostly just intended to be a cute visual effect. However, 2 pets do have combat abilities and can be used in battle. In quick slots, potions, scrolls, and items which summon summons can be used. Scrolls do require a certain level of lore skill though. As for what you get from fighting in this game, the rewards vary because experience points are kinda quirky. Leveling up is also capped at level 16. You can get experience points by defeating an enemy enough to check it off of the bestiary, or by engaging in a fight that completes a quest, but you don't get experience points for defeating the same kind of enemies over and over again. For the most part, these same enemies are faced over and over again. This means that sometimes all you'll get from combat is crafting material or weak gear to resell. That's not to say that the variety of combat situations isn't large. It is large. The world is expansive. Over time, you can fight everything from dragons to spirits to people to lions and so on. The problem is that after many hours, certain enemies do crop up more than others, and a sense of repetition sets in. Essentially, there aren't enough monster types to fill the amount of time that the game takes if you try to do everything. On a side note, fighting the animals across various wilderness maps felt kind of bullying, especially when one animal was labeled as an elder. I mean, it's pretty obvious that a few wolves or lions are going to get slaughtered by a fearsome-looking group of 6, and, commonly, both a gigantic Arctic fox and a bear. It felt like overkill. An old animal makes the aggro situation feel even more ridiculous. It seemed bizarre that they didn't run away like real animals would, but hey, tropes about wild beasts trump nature. I'm used to that in games, but when it happens, it always feels cringy to me. I prefer it when I can avoid fights with incredibly easy prey. I've played some games where if you could absolutely decimate a low-level mob, then it just runs away instead of being aggro. And obviously, I do prefer that system. It feels less silly and pointless. I think it adds to the RPG sense of things by making your party seem intimidating, since some creatures clearly sized you up and said, "Nah, I want to live today. Bye." Yet, overall, combat was fine. It wasn't amazing to me because I've played similar games before and it had its flaws. But, like I said, it was varied enough to be fun for a while. Combat isn't the prime way to gain experience though. Completing quests is the main way. You can also gain experience points from finding new areas, disarming traps, and picking locks. Additionally, whoever picks the lock or disarms the trap gives experience to the entire party. As for other gameplay mechanics, dialogue was often limited, and the choices were rarely interesting. It was enough to generally give agency, but not enough to give nuance or depth, and I sometimes felt that none of the choices were what I wanted or were accurate. Occasionally, they didn't make sense, such as with the example I gave in the lore section of the review, because lies are supposed to be marked, but the game's writing sometimes forgets itself. Another issue is that the dialogue does come with a reputation system, which is often good, but sometimes bad. As with most aspects of this game, it's shaky. For instance, the game touts itself as a world wherein even subtle dialogue choices will affect your reputation. However, that's not always the case. Cruel choices aren't always cruel, lies aren't always lies, benevolence doesn't always matter, and so on. Here are some examples of when things don't matter, but should. Number 1. You can give money to a prostitute to gain a necklace for another NPC. She exclaims with joy that she'll never have to use her body body again and is eager to leave the brothel as soon as she can. You can demand to use her body and say you paid for your time. Her smile falters. She has sex with you despite not wanting to. This is not labeled as cruel. Number 2. You can say that a man decided to torture people because he was manipulated. However, he tells you himself that he would torture them no matter what. Yet, you claiming that he was an innocent, manipulated guy isn't labeled as a lie here, and it is elsewhere. Number 3. You can save someone from dying in an icy chasm, and the grateful villager will give you 300 copper pieces for your trouble. At this point in the game, 300 copper is worth very little to you. In many of the game's interactions, you can refuse money in order to get a reputation bonus or other benefit, and that refusal is marked as a benevolent decision when it's offered. Here, it's not offered. You can't refuse. You get no choice but to take this paltry amount of money. You also get no reputation bonus for saving the villager, and the choice to save him at great risk isn't seen as benevolent by the game, despite the clear risks in doing so. Plus, when it comes to the dialogue options, then the flavor text also often felt lame. For example, I'd reload a save, eat some intelligence-boosting food, and retry a conversation because I wanted to see what would have happened if I'd passed the check. Afterward, I'd only get to say something logical, and then it was immediately dismissed. This sort of trivial check pass was common. It didn't seem to add much because being ignored felt odd. That said, again, this wasn't always the case. There were points when a high stat check could lead to a different outcome. However, these good, interesting checks were often very high, between 17 and 19. I also disliked that the companions couldn't help with dialogue checks, because in tabletop games, teamwork is the core. The strength of a party comes from its members having different strengths and weaknesses. Since Pillars of Eternity is based on a D&D-like system, I found this limitation to be disappointing. After all, the game's essentially a system of rules which is copying a pen and paper system based on teamwork. It's a system that's designed for team balance. Yet, trying to boost core stats on the PC would be the best way to explore the game, because it would open up more dialogue options, which encourages juggling stat boosting items and getting resting bonuses. I find this method of investigation to be disappointing compared to the idea of a well-rounded group. Juggling seems silly to me in context because, for example, why can't the chanter or cipher with a high intelligence signal you with a nod or some other gesture if one passes an intellect check? After all, it seems like a companion character with a high stat should be able to interject, or at least nod to the player character to let them know, hey, I have an idea here. After all, it could still be left up to the player whether or not to let a companion in the party speak, but at least the option would be there. It's also worth mentioning that there's an odd stealth system in the game. Perception is supposed to help you notice hidden things, and the game tells you as much. Yet, spotting hidden traps and treasures went off of the mechanics skill. To get it to work, the player had to make the PC or NPC, whoever had the highest mechanics skill, go into stealth/search mode, which made them crawl slowly along. Otherwise, in normal walking mode, they'd only spot things which were several levels below their skill level. This made finding secrets feel more like a chore than it did fun, because slowly crawling around maps wasn't entertaining to me, and it often wasn't worth the trouble reward-wise. Because of this, I often didn't bother searching. I think that this mechanic was disappointing too, because finding secrets in a game ought to be fun. It ought to feel like an Easter egg hunt, not like slowly crawling. Crafting exists as well, and it's handy but not complex. You can enchant armor, enchant weapons, make potions, make scrolls, and make stat-boosting foods. The recipes are listed and easy to follow. As for the ingredients, they're commonly found at merchants. You can also find many of them in the wild, either through fighting enemies or through gathering plants. Though having a survival skill to gather plants is important. It doesn't have to be on your PC, but someone in the party will need the skill. As for the smoothness of gameplay, there were several glitches. None crashed the game, so they weren't terrible, but I was surprised to encounter many of them. One also did require me to reload a save because I couldn't finish a quest otherwise. On to the glitches. This tentacle kept haunting me. Aloth has a spell which summons 3 tentacles to fight, and it seemed to glitch and cause this. I don't know why it comes with a cloud though. I guess it's sad. Eater's flame shield didn't stay on him visually, and sword reflections often floated around at random. T-poses sometimes happened. The pathfinding also left something to be desired. It usually worked well, but not always. The glitch that required me to reload a save happened in the White March expansion. There were 2 quest items that had to be used, a cog and a lever. I put in the cog, but then the slot to load in the lever couldn't be clicked. I checked my quest log, and it turned out that the game thought that I still had the cog. I had to reload a save because, since I lacked the cog, I obviously couldn't give it to the quest point. When I reloaded, I attached the lever first. Then I went to the cog insert and chose not to put it in, re-entered the dialogue, and then placed the cog. I don't know if attaching the lever first fixed the bug, or if it was because I put the cog in on the second dialogue activation, but either way, the quest was satisfied, and I was able to progress. The look and the sound. The music is lovely and sounds epic. If you count the music in the White March expansions on top of the original tracks, then there are 62 tunes to enjoy. However, on a side note, these aren't all included as an extra with the definitive edition. Only 26 tracks were included as an extra, as MP3s and FLACs, meaning that if you enjoy the soundtrack and want to enjoy it outside of the game as well, then you'd have to get it elsewhere. In total, the 62 tracks add up to 2 hours and 27 minutes long, which allows for a lot of variety as you're playing the game. It never sounded boring during play, and considering how long I played, that's a pretty good achievement. The sound effects are varied, normally on point, and immersive. The voice acting did have some problems when it came to overlapping, though. Townsfolk drowned them out.
Me and Sledge are thinking about heading down, joining a caravan over to Dawning.
Dawning? What for? You like your ogres bigger?
We'd have work
That's
at
what I
least,
get for
and
asking
I'm damn
directions
sick
in the
of
middle
fish.
of nowhere.
Or they triggered over each other.
I didn't mean anything by it. I imagine a man with a head made of fire and light could be very convincing.
Funny thing about Dear Woodens, for all that fire and light, they just treated him like another
And a
authority
shrine
figure.
to Margaret as well. Her clergy belongs there.
Making them sneak and selecting them also generated dialogue snippets, which would interrupt any character speaking.
That's right. Between the 6 of us, I don't think
Hey.
the house has known a single day's quiet.
I'm here.
Of course, a little chaos makes it far easier to
I'll
get away
see what
from
I can
mischief.
find. Yes, I can imagine that comes in handy.
I also had to focus on the characters to hear them, because if they chatted when I was just trying to get from point A to point B quickly and I scrolled away on the map, then the dialogue would be muted.
Though after 5 years, I'll be ready for a break.
Choose from.
Home, of course.
This was done to make characters seem tied to a map location, but it didn't quite make sense because, after all, my character, who would supposedly be the one I heard through, couldn't hear them. I could read whatever they'd said in the chat box, but their voiced lines couldn't be replayed, and since I liked the voice acting, this was often a disappointment. Plus, sometimes their voice dialogues were triggered at inopportune moments, such as right before a scripted event, which caused 2 bantering characters to have a weird pause between responses. Their dialogue would also pause if the game was paused, which meant that walking forward in an area risked an auto-pause interrupting their voices if one was set for enemies being spotted, a hidden spot being noticed, or whatnot. Altogether, this meant that the clearest way to hear them speak was to unnaturally stop everything when they did, and have them pause in the street, forest, or wherever they were at the time.
When do you think you'll venture out again?
I'll stay home for a season after my return, but then I'll rejoin the hunts.
And then you'll embark on another journey, like this one.
Not in this lifetime.
Another odd thing was that their lines were sometimes voiced and sometimes not. This happened often, and I found the inconsistency to be a little jarring.
I've never been to Nasatok. Is it very cold? What creatures wander the tundra? How are your leaders chosen?
The visuals are good for an isometric game. There are many different environments, and the visuals are also complemented by their lovely fitting soundscapes. Zooming in is the best way to fully appreciate the look of the game, and I'll give you a little brief tour because the world's art is definitely one of the better features of the game. From the beach, to the forest, to the dungeon, to the river, the ocean near the town, taverns, and more. That said, it's not visually perfect. There were also some small visual glitches here and there throughout the game.
I'm here.
Final thoughts. Pillars of Eternity is a mixed bag in many ways. It has a large world with epic adventures, but the world's lore isn't consistent. Meanwhile, sometimes quests are fun, and sometimes they aren't. This makes it a big setting, but not a cohesive one. Stalwart is another good example. The town's supposed to grow as the story progresses, because people are moving there for jobs and opportunity.
A couple months ago, I heard Stalwart was offering land and opportunity to new settlers, so figured I'd give it a go out here. For a while, folks seemed glad to have some new blood, but that changed as more and more of us came. We take the best jobs, we don't pay our respects to Andra, we're overcrowding the town. I get it. Stalwart's changing. Same thing happened in New Yarma when folk moved in from the countryside.
Yet, more buildings and NPCs to reflect this change don't appear. Instead, there's a weird map change. One woman's house is replaced by a shop. This is a weird change because that shop shouldn't be there. Before this replacement happens, the owner of the house, a woman, can live or die based on the player's actions.
Katie's house is burning! Hurry, they're both in there!
In my playthrough, I had saved her, and she hung out in the local tavern afterward. She said that her home was going to be rebuilt. Later on, it wasn't, and the shop was just there, replacing it. To see her suddenly made homeless was odd, because it made it seem as if the game forgot that she was still alive. Additionally, the game randomly replacing her house with a shop, and not changing the town to reflect the influx of immigrants, was also a weird contrast. I wondered if it was addressed, but when I went into the tavern, she was still there, and had no new dialogue. That made her whole interaction along the lines of, "Save me! Thank you. My house will be rebuilt soon."
Hello, ma'am. Anything I can do for you? Hello, ma'am. Anything I can do for you?
Altogether, instead of feeling put together, it seemed as if the world was kinda hollow. I felt as if the devs went for quantity over quality.
By how much money came pouring in, we were kind of expecting it to be high, but not that high and not that fast. And so people really demanded stretch goals right away. Our fans have a kind of conceived notion of how big these types of games are, just based on the games like Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2, Icewind Dale. They have, they expect at least a 40 to 100 hour game, like tons of content.
All of us were in a lot of ways scrambling. I mean, and hopefully what it looked like from the outside is that while we had our crap together. On the inside, it didn't always feel that way.
And people noticed. Like, some people would say, like, it sounds like you guys are just kind of making stuff up as you go along. And I'm like, well, like, I kind of am. And they're like, well, why isn't this all thought out? Because that's why we're kickstarting it.
Making games is hard, man. It is. I think people say, gosh, it must be so fun to make games. And I wouldn't want to do anything else, but it's nerve-wracking sometimes.
We discovered some things yesterday with the weapon bone. The way we were creating the
We're always so horrible at estimating how long it's going to take to do something. I think to be efficient with his time, you should, if he's made something for you, you should make sure that it works. Right. And it's because generally nobody ever wants to be so honest as to imagine that they're going to have problems And this thing that looks like it should take 2 days is really probably going to take 3 or 4.
It's not rocket science.
It is rocket science,
it's
though.
Game science.
Otherwise, when he says it's done, it would be done, and then but sometimes it's not really done.
The cutscene system is essential.
Sure.
Absolutely, but I guess what I'm saying is like, then we need to figure out what's not, and or get more time. And I don't know if we can get more time. That's the problem. As a producer, nobody likes what you do. You know, you're the guy that has to sometimes be a jerk and go like, hey, this really cool thing that everybody wants in game, we can't do it. At the end of every single game, we go through and we go like, look, you know, we really need to cut back on our scope. And we all agree. We do this every time. Everybody nods. Oh yeah, absolutely. We should cut back on scope and get some really well-defined, you know, even if it's small. So initially, Adam was doing a lot of the production role. So I was brought on in June, and I was brought on as the lead producer to take over those roles. And that frees up Adam to be able to program. And then every single time this happens where nobody wants to cut anything, because everybody wants everything in, and then we get into a spot where everything has to go in because everything's half in, and then we have half-built systems. Realistically, all the devs want everything in, and I mean, we all want that, right? There's like a million cool things that we all want to see in the game, but ultimately there's a schedule, there's a budget. I know I'm being a dick here, but like we need to really lock this down.
There's just a tremendous amount of content in this game. I felt like we were keeping things in check, but it's just grown. The second highest game would probably be Neverwinter Nights. For whatever reason, Eternity ended up being a lot larger.
There's a massive amount to explore and read. Even the unique weapons, armor, and accessories almost all come with little stories. You can also have one of several pets. There's even a quirky hat which requires a bar crawl to unlock its full potential. Yet, little of this massive world bonds together well. That's why I don't think it's put together well. This cloak's backstory or this sword's backstory has no bearing on the world's setting, no position other than being a trinket. Meanwhile, the important parts of the main story are filled with holes and even major lore, such as the Watcher being able to transcend language barriers by speaking through the soul itself, become discarded, trivial, dismissed points whenever the plot wants them to be. And in truth, that dismissive nature causes most things to seem trivial as the story unfolds. From cloaks to abilities, nothing much is truly relevant. The tale's fun enough to hold up for a long while, but then it does become boring eventually, and does so before everything's done. It seems filled with promise, filled with ambition, which is never quite reached. I didn't strongly enjoy it by the end, and I can see why I didn't remember it well after playing it once a long time ago. To give it a fair review and make sure that I didn't miss content, I did do almost everything in the game. I know that it's a well-loved and popular isometric RPG, and since that's a genre and format I do lean towards, and I had a medication issue for a bit where I felt super tired and could do little else in my free time, I took the time to explore it thoroughly. I wanted to be sure that I wasn't missing any reasons why it was good, especially since I've read that many people enjoyed it for its story, and I wasn't enjoying it as time went on. I figured that since I was so tired and gameplay was smooth sailing, why not see it through? Maybe, I reasoned, side quests would help to patch up the main lore with additional answers. They didn't, though. It was a pretty world to get lost in. Combat was okay, but even in my tired state, much disappointed me, and that disappointment got worse as I went. I probably should have stopped sooner. Once my med issue was handled, and I felt more alert, I'd finally lost patience with it, and by then, I'd played it at a leisurely pace for about 122 hours over the course of a couple of months. Oh, and it's worth noting that I'd also kept my recorder going so that, despite being extremely tired, I wouldn't misremember things later on, but that also made sorting through the footage. Yeah, there was a lot to go through. This review took a bit. It's also part of why it's so long. But despite the game's many flaws, I do tend to like isometric RPGs. It's just a genre and format that I lean towards, like I said. Would I have finished it if I wasn't so out of it? Probably, though I really doubt that I would have given it as much of my time. Yet, that doesn't change the fact that it still had its good points, and when I did get bored, I still was curious enough to complete it. I wanted to know how it ended. I liked the look and the sound of the game too. This means that, despite its problems, I don't dislike the game overall. Instead of dislike, I feel very mixed feelings towards it, which wind up being neutral overall. The good and the bad kind of balance. However, due to its excellent sound and graphics, I gotta bump it up a point to a 6 out of 10 instead of a neutral 5 out of 10. And if you do decide to play it, and haven't yet, then I recommend skipping most of the side quests and tasks. I think that you have to do this stuff with Gathbin to keep your keep. Others might be desirable quests to do in order to boost reputation, such as A Mother's Plea in Gilded Vale, but the side quests and tasks that I thought were particularly worthwhile were the following. I think that these events, in addition to some of the main quests, of course, were where the better content was to be found.